In this video, we're going to discuss how frames and keyframes work in Flash. It's very important to understand frames and keyframes before we can really get started animating. So I'm going to use the text tool, and we're going to create sort of a slideshow. It's not really going to be a slideshow because we don't have images that we're going to show, but we're going to show a series of numbers over time. So let's choose a different color for our font, and we're just going to type in the number 1 here. Okay, we're going to make this larger. Let's use the free transform tool and hold on to Shift to make it larger. And then if we want to align this to the center of the stage, we can go to the Align panel, make sure that To Stage is selected, then we'll align the horizontal and the vertical centers. There we go. We can close that. Okay, so we've put the number 1 here. And as you'll notice, we're working with 12 frames per second. So if we wanted to create some kind of slideshow where the number 1 shows up for 2 seconds, and then it switches to the number 2, and so on, we wouldn't want the number 2 to show up until we got to frame 49, because we're working at 12 frames per second. So 1 second would be 12 frames. The second would start at frame 13 and it would last till frame 24. And then the third second would start actually at frame 25, not 49. I was thinking of 24 frames per second. So 2 seconds later, we want the number 2 to show up here. So I'm going to click in frame 25. I'm going to go to Insert, Timeline, Keyframe. Now, a keyframe is basically a frame where something important happens, where something changes. So we're going to click to add a new keyframe there. And in this new keyframe, whenever we do that, you'll notice it actually copies the contents that were in this first keyframe. But we're at a different point in time here, and we can see, I'm going to click just somewhere in the middle so that we can see both keyframes. We can see that each keyframe has its own little black dot in it. Now, if we have a blank keyframe with nothing on the stage, it'll have a white dot in it. But basically, each one of these represents a keyframe. And then all of these frames in between just represent normal frames. Now, if we click somewhere in frame 15, for example, we'll see that this number 1 is selected, but this number 1 is still the same number 1 that's in this first keyframe. It only changes once we get to frame 25, where this new keyframe is. Let me show you how that works. If we click in frame 10, for example, double-click inside our text field, highlight the number 1, and change it to a 2, and then hit Escape, you'll notice that if we jump back to frame 1, we've actually changed that the number for frame 1. Even though we edit it over here in frame 10 or frame 15 or frame 20 or whatever frame we were in, if we try to edit that graphic anywhere along this timeline before we get to the next keyframe, it's going to edit it basically for this entire keyframe. So basically all of these frames are considered part of that first keyframe. Let's hit Control Z to undo that. We'll have to hit Control Z a few times until we get back to the number 1 here. There we go. Okay, so we're back to number 1. Now what we want to do is jump out to frame 25 where we have a new keyframe, and in that new keyframe we'll double click on the number 1. Highlight it. Let's actually align it to the center so that when we change it, when we change the number and the width changes, it'll still be centered in the stage. So it's centered. Now let's change this to number 2 and hit Escape. Now that we've done that, we can click back on any of these frames before and we see that those frames remain untouched because we changed it in this new keyframe. So if we wanted the number 3 to appear 2 seconds later, we would basically move over 24 more frames. So those 2 seconds would end in frame 49, and then we would start in frame 50 with a new frame, a new keyframe. Now we can get a new keyframe by going to Insert, Timeline, Keyframe, or you can simply select the frame in question and hit F6 on the keyboard, and that will add a new keyframe for you. So then we could change this to a number 3 and hit Escape to exit out of type editing mode. So we see that the number 1 is on the stage, and it stays on the stage for 2 seconds until we get to frame 25, and then it changes to the number 2. That stays on the frame for 2 seconds until we get to frame 50, then it changes to 3. Now, by default, Flash is going to loop this animation over and over again. So if we have the 3 there and we only have it there for 1 frame, it's not going to appear for very long. For example, if we test our movie now by going to Control, Test Movie, or by hitting Control, Enter, or Command Return on the keyboard, we can see that animation. And it moves through 3 so quickly that you might not even see it appear. But basically, it's moving steadily through this timeline, and once it gets to frame 3, it immediately jumps back to the beginning. So if we want that 3 to stay on there for 2 seconds as well, we'll have to jump out to frame, what is it, 74? And in frame 74, we'll insert a new frame. Now we're not inserting a keyframe here, we're just inserting a frame. And the way we do that is go to Insert, Timeline, Frame, or you can hit F5 on your keyboard. So we'll click on that, and you'll notice that it just inserts a plain frame. Now you'll notice that each of these keyframes ends at the very last frame. It has a little, basically a white rectangle on it, and that just represents the end of that particular keyframe. There's nothing really special about that rectangle. There's nothing different about this frame than the frame before it. It just represents the end of a particular keyframe. So now this number 3 should stay on the screen for 2 seconds before it jumps back to frame 1. So we test our movie again by hitting Control, Enter, or Command Return. We see the number 1, the number 2, and then the number 3 stays on for a couple seconds before it jumps back to number 1. So hopefully that exercise will help you to understand how frames and keyframes work in Flash.